All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'd like to introduce our authors today. Jeff Marietta is an entrepreneur in residence at the University of the Cumberlands and founder of Invest 606, a business accelerator and pitch contest for Eastern Kentucky. And we also have Sky Marietta, who is an assistant professor at the University of the Cumberlands and director of the Learning Commons, a peer-based program to support the academic achievement of vulnerable college students. Both Jeff and Sky are alumni of the Ed School. After I stop sharing my screen, Jeff and Sky will begin their presentation and we'll leave about 20 minutes for Q&A. Please enter your questions into the Q&A feature. Chat will be disabled. Jeff and Sky, you can take it from here.
Great, thank you.
Hi, we're so glad to be here, and we see some familiar faces among the attendees. It's pretty exciting to get to visit Cambridge virtually and talk with people from a broader audience about something that we care a lot about, which is the education of a very large population of rural children in this country, and especially at a time when we often think of so many problems in education as being urban. So Jeff's pulling up our presentation right now.
Great, yeah. And just so everyone knows, we're talking to you from Eastern Kentucky here in Williamsburg, Kentucky. It's in the very southeastern part of the state. We're just about 10 miles from the border of Tennessee, and we're kind of smack dab in the middle of the Appalachian Mountains. People would say we're in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. So just to kick everything off, we wanted to get everyone grounded on what is rural? What does rural mean? And it means a lot of different things to different people. But the first graph you see here is just the decline in proportion of rural population in the United States. You can see in the early 1900s, 60% of the US population was classified as rural. And that proportion has declined. At the same time, the number of people living in rural communities has actually stayed the same. So way back in the 1860s, the US Census Bureau actually started classifying rural versus urban. And it started, like a lot of things, a long time ago to be problematic. And the US Census Bureau basically started with a definition of urban, and then everything else was sort of rural. And that kind of urban-centric definition continues today. So the classic definition of rural uses this urban-centric population density, land use characteristics, and distance to define an urban area first, and then everything else is rural. And when you use just this definition, which we're going to draw attention to as being problematic, you still end up with 20% of the population today in the United States being considered rural. And that's 60 million people in the United States who are considered or classified rural.
We want to make sure people understand that rural populations are probably really undercounted, because when it's an exclusionary definition, something like having a town with 50,000 people in your county can suddenly make you urban no matter what. So for example, you can see a couple of examples that we know personally. St. Louis County, Minnesota, 900,000 acres of wildland. It's a very large county, but because the town of Duluth is in a very small corner of it, everyone who lives in that entire county is typically designated as urban. And then one of the places that we really scratch our head about is Harlan County, or Harlan, the town of Harlan in Kentucky. Population of 1,400 people. You would have to drive 2 hours to hit an interstate, and you would not pass any major towns along the way. And somehow that still could be clustered as urban. So part of that is we want to draw attention to this because we're still talking about 13 million children, even with this vast underrepresentation. And one of the misconceptions we often have about rural areas is that these are declining locations, declining populations. You know, maybe they're dying out, and something that's dying out is not something that you need to pay attention to. But in fact, rural populations are staying steady. And if we took all the rural school children in America, it would be more than the population of the 120 biggest urban districts in this country. And if we were thinking about policies and programs, if we said, hey, we can improve outcomes for the 120 largest school districts in America, that would be something that's considered very important. And we want to shine that kind of importance on some of our rural students.
Yeah, and just point of reference here, Sky and I both met in New Mexico.
Yes.
As teachers on the Navajo reservation. I was born in Hibbing, which is up in St. Louis County, and then Sky's family is originally from Harlan. So we've lived in these places, we've taught in these places, we've been there for years, and it as we started to do the research on this book, it just blew our minds that these places were considered urban by some definition in the U.S. Census Bureau. So you have a clear picture. There's millions and millions of students, millions and millions of people all over the United States from all walks of life who live in rural areas. And today, we want to make the point that rural matters more than ever. And when we were living in Cambridge in 2015, and we moved that year down to Harlan County, right as the Republican primaries and the Democratic primaries were going on. And sure enough, Donald Trump was nominated as the Republican nominee and went on to win the election. And all of a sudden, rural communities got a light shined on them, and the issues and the challenges. Well, the thing is that the problems that have been facing rural communities have been festering and going on for decades. And I just we need to point this out, because this is a question of inequality and societal stability and the future of our country and democracy. That's how important it is to address rural communities right now. And this is a simple chart here showing percent of employment in urban, high-density rural, and low-density rural areas. Now, this data are old, from 2007, but that's really, you can see the spread, and it's worsened over the last 10 to 15 years. But if we just highlight the services industry, you can see that it's almost doubled in proportion of the percent of jobs in urban areas and in rural areas over the last 30 to 40 years. Meanwhile, in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and manufacturing, those have been halved proportionally. And if you just look at the proportion in rural areas, it's absolutely destroyed the economies. And that has a very human toll to it. And then you mix in the opioid epidemic, which hit rural areas first. It just has created, in our opinion, a crisis. Add in the digital divide and lack of access to basic infrastructure. And we need serious investment both in education and in economic development. It's a two-part problem that needs to be addressed immediately. You want to take this one, or do you want me to? Or I'll just keep rolling. So that in itself, and we'll dig into this a little bit, and we'll talk about the brain drain that everyone loves to get fixated on. But this has led to sort of this huge gap in educational attainment for people aged 25 years and older in rural communities. So this is a chart showing metro and non-metro, and you can see that post-secondary attainment is there's a huge gap between non-metro and metro areas. And this isn't because rural families don't want their kids to go to school. In fact, rural families want their kids to go to school just as much, or go to college just as much as urban families. And this isn't because rural kids aren't prepared to go to school. They score on average, even taking into account poverty in 4th and 8th grade on math and reading as a national average. It's really, we're talking about an entrenched and complicated problem that is wrapped within the community and the schools and the economy.
One piece of this too, we want to point out a lot, is the diversity and variability in rural communities, right? So this is on average across non-metro communities. And you can imagine, in Harlan County, Kentucky, for example, it's closer to 10% of the adult population has any form of post-secondary education. You look at places like the Navajo Nation or parts of South Dakota or the Deep South, across all of this, we also have pockets of communities that have been historically marginalized for decades. And they're some of our most underrepresented communities in our empirical knowledge base and in our policies and approaches to promoting equality in the country. And we also have one of these big issues that the pandemic has really brought to light this year. The digital divide is a very real, serious, entrenched problem, especially as more and more people access things like a college degree through online programs. Many rural communities are in what's considered a higher education desert in the land area representation. Well, how do you access school if you don't have access to the internet? And then, of course, this year, a very large problem happened when schools shut down. A lot of rural communities have been closed for most of the pandemic. And we know that 39% of the rural population, compared to just 4% of the urban population, do not have access to broadband service. And of course, this problem is far worse in communities where there's higher levels of poverty. But practically speaking, this was just devastating. I mean, the example we often tell is one of our own children. So we have our youngest child's in first grade, and we live in a community where only 30% of the homes even have access to any internet at all, let alone the speeds that would be needed to stream videos. Well, you can't do school over Zoom if most of your students don't have access to internet to support that. So practically speaking, a lot of rural schools have moved to paper packets. Now imagine your first grade experience is done solely through a paper packet. Our school just reopened 2 weeks ago, and that was the first time in his entire first grade experience that my child got to hear a teacher do a read aloud with him. Now they've tried to do workarounds for that, but looking at a tablet and having an automated book or access to audiobooks just is not the same as the kind of discussion that can take place with peers or some of that language building that can happen around discussion. We're thinking a lot right now when we read the news about how school closures are going to impact urban students. It's often phrased or pointed as an urban problem. And my guess is that we have no idea how this lack of infrastructure around broadband has impacted many of our rural communities who not only have not had access to physical experience of school, but haven't had access to a digital experience of school this year either.
Don't worry, we're going to get into the good things about rural communities. We just wanted to hit you all first with
to get you on board.
To just try to explain to you all how important this is to us and how important this is to education and policy.
Yes, this is a very important point because again, if you look at a state like New Mexico, in the state of New Mexico, 25% of people don't have access to the internet. But again, if we're looking at places like the Navajo Nation or the Deep South, we certainly have populations that have very limited access to internet.
All right. So the strengths, and this is the part where I think we always, as researchers, I think try to problematize things. And so I think we had you, on board with explaining to you some of the challenges, but this is where we found that things get kind of controversial in our book, is actually talking about some of the strengths of rural communities. And we lay out these 4 strengths, and I'm just going to read them, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper into each of these. So one is just a greater connection to the natural world and foodways. When you're out in a rural community, you just have access to larger open spaces. Rural communities actually do have highly qualified, excellent educators with deep cultural knowledge. There's also strong, deep, and stable family ties and social networks in rural communities. And then finally, in rural communities compared to urban and suburban, there's greater socioeconomic and racial integration. So I think what we'll do is we're just going to hit top level on each of these to give you a piece or a taste of some of the research that's behind this. Do you want to take one of those first, or do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you talk about Raj Chetty and this?
Okay, sure. So this is the one that everyone always gets upset about. So Raj Chetty, which you guys are at Harvard, you know who he is, eminent economist, and he has this incredible research project that basically breaks down income and inequality and social mobility by zip code. And about 5 years ago, he had this study that showed that the more rural you are, the more likely you are to move up in socioeconomic status. And that finding kind of got hidden through a lot of other research, but for rural researchers, it was incredible because it showed that, wow, the further you live away from an urban area, the better chance you had of moving up in social class. And so some researchers in Washington, University of Washington, said, well, this can't be the case. There must be something fuzzy with the data. Maybe it's rural communities that have universities. Maybe it's, Amherst or these other areas that's really kind of, messing up the data. So they dug a little bit deeper, and what they found, actually, it's the more rural, the hyper rural places had an even better chance, the kids there, of moving up in socioeconomic status throughout their lives. So, there's a lot of people have put up a lot of different explanations about why this is the case, and we'd love to hear what you all think about it. But for us, in as researchers and practitioners and people who've lived and taught in rural communities, it makes sense. In rural communities, the amount of socioeconomic integration is far greater than it is in urban communities. The doctors, the lawyers, all of the professional services, well-educated people, all their kids go to school with the laborers, the service workers, the unemployed, the disabled, the people living in poverty. At our own school that we send our kids to, it's 90% free and reduced price lunch. Our kids get Tom's shoes sent home with them. They get access to free food, all this kind of stuff. And they go to school with the doctors and the county executives and all those. And they also go to school with some kids who grow up in really challenging circumstances. And we all know the research that shows how having different backgrounds coming together provides some resiliency and better outcomes for all students. So I'll kind of stop there, and you want to?
Yeah, one of the things that we push on a lot is, so often when there's problems in education, we push it back down on the teachers in the school. So we saw this gap in educational attainment, and we usually think, oh, well, that's a problem with the quality of the education. But again, as Jeff pointed out, it's not that the test scores are necessarily low leading up to that. And one of the interesting things about many rural communities, not all of them, but in many rural communities, a teaching job is an excellent job. It's an excellent career opportunity, especially for women. It's competitive pay with the median income. And what you often find is very highly qualified teachers who have been part of the community for a long time. So some of the miscommunications that can happen when a teacher comes in as a cultural outsider and maybe doesn't know language traditions or the background of the student, that can be mediated. And that's an incredible strength and part of the deep and stable family ties and social networks. Rural schools are the heart of their community. They form a very strong community center. They're often the ones who provide a range of services to children, feeding them over the summer, but also you might get your doctor's appointments at the school. It might be the place that when a family has their house burned down, it's the school that gathers together and post fundraisers and make sure that the family has a place to go. It's a place where people gather for entertainment because, it's where the Friday night lights, the football games are going on. So schools have a very strong position in rural communities to impact change. And they have some of those great pieces behind them that we could really, act upon when you have strong people in place to really improve and do good things for the community.
Yeah, I think on the last point and on the greater connection to the natural world and foodways, what did doctorates and you had started a software company, you had all this what many would consider this dream life, and then you moved to Harlan